Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. From the triumphs of Austerlitz to the frozen retreat from Moscow, this memoir thrusts you into the heart of the action. These are his words. Let's begin. The pride of Napoleon and his confidence in his power had reached their peak following the conquest of Prussia. Nothing seemed impossible to him, and in his vast projects he recognized no limit other than his own will. Master of the Oder River line, he was preparing to cross it and move forward to confront the Russian army advancing on the Vistula. His most formidable enemy, England, remained the only one he could not engage directly. However, he viewed the powers of Europe as vassals of England. By attacking them, he believed he was indirectly fighting England. He thus declared that he would not make peace with Prussia and Russia unless it included England, and that he would not return any of his conquests until England restored the colonies it had taken from France, Holland, or Spain, the allies of France. As he energetically expressed, he wanted to reconquer the colonies by land. However, the decision to advance toward the Vistula and possibly beyond posed significant challenges. The farther one moves from home territory, the greater the difficulties become. The army's losses needed to be repaired, its numbers increased, its maintenance ensured, its communications secured, and provisions found in a poor country with the approach of winter. Historians detail the methods employed to achieve these goals and the extraordinary intelligence and immense activity displayed by Napoleon on this occasion. The Grande Armée, which had an effective strength of 450,000 men at the departure from Boulogne and 500,000 at the start of the war with Prussia, reached 580,000. Since the Austrian and Prussian campaigns had each cost the army scarcely 20,000 men, it grew with every campaign instead of diminishing, as discharges were not allowed during wartime. Furthermore, advancing so deeply into Germany placed Napoleon amidst, if not outright enemies, at least neutrals or unreliable allies. It must not be overlooked that all the states of Europe were our enemies, as was evident in 1813. It was necessary to intimidate some through threats and entice others with promises. This is how Saxony, an enemy during the previous campaign, became our ally through its admission into the Confederation of the Rhine. It was also true that Poland offered the possibility of more sincere allies. To reach the Vistula and approach Warsaw, it was necessary to cross the Duchy of Posen. It was clear that the presence of French troops would stir the country to rise up in the hope of regaining independence. However, this alone was enough to alarm Austria, which France needed to handle carefully. Austria had already indicated that its losses prevented it from taking part in the conflict and that neutrality was imposed upon it. Yet it was simultaneously assembling a force of 60,000 men to protect its borders. These observation corps often turned into active armies when favorable circumstances transformed neutrality into hostility. Napoleon addressed Austria directly. He suggested that in the event of Poland's restoration, Silesia could be offered as compensation for Galicia. If this arrangement was unsuitable, he assured Austria that while supporting the insurrection of Russian and Prussian Poland, actions consistent with the rights of war, France would not act against Austria's interests. Additionally, Napoleon declared his readiness for any eventuality and his willingness to fight Austria if, despite the friendly disposition he displayed, it chose to engage in conflict. Meanwhile, misunderstandings between Turkey and Russia, skillfully nurtured by Napoleon, forced Russia to deploy a 60,000-man corps along the Dniester River. Thus, Napoleon was about to resume war against Russia, supported by England, Sweden, and 20,000 Prussians, the remnants of their army. France's allies included the Confederation of the Rhine and soon Turkey. Austria remained uneasy and silent. An agitated Poland was preparing to join the French cause. This was the situation at the resumption of hostilities. From the Oder to the Vistula, no enemies were expected. The Prussians occupied Thorn, while the Russians were only approaching Warsaw. The order of march from right to left was as follows. On the extreme right, Prince Jérôme, assisted by General Vandamme, was tasked with occupying Silesia, besieging fortresses along the upper Oder, such as Glogau and Breslau, thereby securing full control of the river. He was then to cross it and cover the army's right flank, anchored on the Austrian border. Marshal Davout's Third Corps moved from Kustrin towards Posen. To his left marched Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps, and further left was Marshal Lannes's 5th Corps, departing from Stettin. These combined forces totaled 80,000 men. The 1st, 4th and 6th Corps, along with the Imperial Guard and the Cavalry Reserve, remained behind as a supporting force of another 80,000 men. This was when the question of restoring Poland arose. Marshal Davout was received in Posen with great enthusiasm. The Duchy of Posen, part of Prussia, seemed more eager than other provinces to shake off foreign rule. The French arrival appeared to signal independence, and though nothing explicit was said, Poland's cause seemed intertwined with that of France. The same sentiments were later displayed in Warsaw. Levies of men were ordered, and initially met with ease. But soon the Polish nobility began to question the wisdom of rashly following this course. Military fortunes could turn, and they feared falling back under the yoke of Prussia and Russia, enraged by their revolt. They wanted Napoleon to commit to reconstituting Poland with a sovereign from his family. This proposal was formally presented by Prince Murat upon his entry into Warsaw. Napoleon was displeased by this. He understood well enough that Murat himself was the intended sovereign, as suggested by the Pole's enthusiasm, his chivalric demeanour, and his already semi-Polish attire. Napoleon, however, did not want conditions imposed on him. He was also troubled by the implications of such a decisive step. Peace with Prussia and Russia would become more difficult. Furthermore, restoring Poland without Galicia would provoke Austria. Napoleon wanted the Poles to commit to him fully, without conditions, and for a national uprising to force history's hand, making Poland's restoration inevitable. As Thiers aptly remarked, the Poles asked Napoleon to proclaim their independence first, while Napoleon wanted them to earn it. Moreover, could their support inspire great confidence? Personally, I doubted it, and this opinion was not unique. Marshals Lannes and Augereau, advancing to the left of Posen, found the rural population reluctant to revolt. They warned the emperor against being dazzled by the nobles' superficial enthusiasm in Posen, noting that Poles were historically fickle, divided, and anarchic. Rebuilding them as a nation would, they argued, waste French blood on a fragile and fleeting endeavour. Napoleon, therefore, avoided encouraging or fully discouraging them. He refused to appear in Warsaw himself. He used them as convenient allies, ready to abandon them if necessary, which he ultimately did. After entering Posen, the army advanced toward Warsaw. The Russian army occupying the city did not attempt to defend it and retreated across the Vistula, destroying the bridge behind them. I now resume the account of the 6th Corps. I mentioned that this army corps was part of the reserve. We departed from Berlin in our turn. The General Staff travelled post-haste to Posen, where we arrived on November 15th, while the troops made their way. We stayed at the residence of Madame de Zastrow, wife of the former Prussian governor of this city, who had followed the king to Königsberg. I saw her several times. She was a gentle and kind person, though understandably sad and preoccupied. The misfortunes of Prussia, the uncertainty about her husband's fate, and the responsibility of protecting her 3 young and beautiful daughters amidst an army like ours were sufficient causes of distress. One can imagine how painful it must have been for the wife of the Prussian governor of Posen to witness the enthusiasm stirred by our presence in the city. The emperor arrived on the evening of November 27th, without any pomp. Even though it was night and he could not be seen, my hostess insisted on going to meet him. She waited in the rain for a long time, walking in the mud, feeling fortunate to catch a fleeting glimpse of his carriage. On November 28th, the army entered Warsaw. Apart from the political importance of this conquest, Warsaw secured for us a crossing point over the Vistula. Marshal Davout had already crossed the river, which the Russians did not defend any more than they had defended the city. Marshal Lannes, 5th Corps, replaced him in Warsaw. Augereau's 7th Corps was stationed further downstream along the Vistula, opposite Modlin. The Emperor tasked Marshal Ney with capturing the city of Thorn, securing a second crossing point over the Vistula, essential for his subsequent operations. We departed Posen on December 1st, and the 1st Brigade arrived before Thorn on December 4th, passing through Gnesen and Bromberg. Thorn, located on the right bank of the Vistula, has only the suburb of Podgorz on the left bank. Crossing the river was necessary to enter the city. 15,000 Prussians, commanded by General Lestock, defended it. The wooden bridge connecting the two banks had been destroyed. Colonel Savary of the 14th Line Regiment, 7th Corps, who had remained behind, occupied Podgorz. On December 4th, upon learning that the enemy was beginning to evacuate the city and trusting the favour of the local population, he boldly crossed the Vistula on boats with a small portion of his regiment, despite the ice floes. The endeavour was all the riskier because the Vistula's width at that point left them exposed to enemy gunfire from the opposite bank. Polish boatmen supported the effort, wading into the water and pulling the boats ashore under enemy fire. The 1st Brigade of the 6th Corps, which had already arrived at Podgorz as mentioned earlier, crossed the Vistula, joined the 14th Regiment, and seized the city. The Marshal was still at Bromberg, 8 leagues behind, on December 4th. He only learned of the city's capture on the morning of December 5th. He immediately travelled to the suburb of Podgorz and entered Thorn on the morning of December 6th. I was alone with him at the time, and on the evening of December 5th he sent me to Thorn, already occupied by the 1st Division of the 6th Corps, joined by the 14th Regiment. I was pleased to congratulate my former battalion commander on the exemplary conduct of his regiment, and the following day he received even greater accolades than mine. The troops of the 6th Corps arrived progressively and were positioned in a circle on the right bank of the Vistula, with light cavalry at the forefront to guard against Cossack incursions. Work to repair the bridge began in earnest, though the task proved more challenging than anticipated. Despite capturing the city on December 5th, the bridge was only repaired by December 15th. The 59th Regiment, the last to arrive, crossed the Vistula by boat on December 13th. As previously mentioned, this regiment had remained garrisoned in Magdeburg until November 25th, arriving in Thorn on December 13th after 18 days of continuous marching without a moment's rest. This level of strain was unnecessary. The regiment could have departed earlier or been granted 1 or 2 rest stops along the lengthy route. The officer dispatched from Thorn to Magdeburg to deliver the marching orders to the 59th Regiment only returned with the regiment itself. Thus, despite having postal privileges, he took 18 days to travel 110 leagues like an infantry regiment. This was his usual practice to avoid both the hardships and dangers of war. This fresh example of his zeal and activity amused us greatly. With Warsaw and Thorn secured and Graudenz besieged and on the verge of falling, the winter could have been spent capturing Danzig, which would have given us complete control of the Vistula. However, the season and poor road conditions necessitated establishing winter quarters. Napoleon considered this especially as he believed the Russians were in full retreat toward the Pregel to cover Königsberg. He soon learned that they seemed to be setting up near Warsaw, between the Narew and Ukra rivers, on the right bank of the Vistula. These two rivers converge before flowing into the Vistula, forming an angle with its apex resting on the main river just below Warsaw. Prussian troops stationed between Danzig and Königsberg were linked to the Russians near Thorn. Only 20,000 armed Prussians remained, with 10,000 stationed as garrisons. The First Russian Army, commanded by General Benningsen, occupied positions along the Narew. The Second, led by General Buxhoden, was positioned farther back at Ostrolenka, bringing their combined strength to 80,000 men. In this situation, the Russians could unite with the Prussians near the sea, support themselves on the stronghold of Danzig, cross the lower Vistula, and flank us on the upper Vistula. Alternatively, leaving the Prussians to observe Königsberg, they could concentrate their forces in the angle formed by the Ukra and Narew and advance on Warsaw. Napoleon was prepared to counter either strategy and repel any enemy attempt. However, he had no intention of allowing them to attack first, nor would he permit them to establish winter quarters so close to him. While he wanted to rest his troops by halting the pursuit, he first aimed to defeat the enemy decisively. Napoleon left Posen after a 19-day stay and entered Warsaw discreetly at night to avoid formal receptions and commitments with the Poles. By December 23rd, he was at the head of his army and personally directed the nighttime crossing of the Ukra at Okunin. I will not recount the battles fought on December 24th, 25th, and 26th, known as the battles of Pultusk and Golemin. The 6th Corps did not participate, and this document serves merely as the journal of the aide-de-camp of Marshal Ney. I will only note that the Ukra was successfully crossed, the Russians were pursued on December 25th, and they were attacked on December 26th by Marshal Lannes at Okunin and by Marshals Davout and Augereau at Golemin. The enemy, repelled everywhere, lost 80 cannons, significant baggage, and 20,000 men, including both the killed and captured. The Russians were in full retreat, and the Emperor had achieved his goal of pushing them away from Warsaw. However, poor weather and the terrain's nature complicated operations and prevented a complete victory. The terrain, naturally marshy, became impassable due to snow and rain. The mud of Pultusk became infamous among our soldiers. Men sank knee-deep into the liquid mire, and many perished in it. Moving artillery required doubling the teams, and even then, progress was barely possible. Initially, this made it impossible to monitor enemy movements accurately. Thus, Marshal Lannes found himself alone at Pultusk facing superior forces, as it was believed the bulk of the enemy army had retreated to Golemin. Furthermore, after the victory, pursuing the Russians was impossible, allowing them to retreat unimpeded, a retreat they attempted to frame as a victory. Napoleon's star was beginning to dim. The era of partial successes and incomplete triumphs had begun. This also marked the start of the army's hardships, shortages of food and forage, and countless deprivations that I will recount. The attack on the Russians was supported on the left by the 1st and 6th Corps, with the latter forming the far left wing. We departed Thorn on December 18th, passing through Gollop, Strasbourg, and Zielona. The Prussians retreated as we advanced. The 1st Division, leading the march, encountered them at Soldau and drove them out after fierce resistance on December 26th, the day of the Battle of Pultusk. I was not present for this engagement, as I had been sent the previous day to Marshal Bernadotte to coordinate our movements. I left Zielona in the evening and, after failing to find him at Biezun, located him the next morning in a village 3 leagues away, just as he was about to leave. I travelled 3 leagues with him to a village near Malawa, from which he sent me back that evening to Marshal Ney, whom I found the following morning in Soldau. This was the only time I encountered the future King of Sweden, who struck me as quite different from our other generals. First, he was perfectly amiable to everyone, an immediate distinction. He showed great kindness to me, despite knowing only my name. He dined with his aides-de-camp and officers on mission. Noticing that my horse was extremely fatigued, he provided me with another so I could travel alongside him. On the evening of my departure, the weather was dreadful. Jokingly, I mentioned that I would try not to drop his dispatch in the snow. He suggested I stay until the next day, offering to add a postscript to his letter explaining to Marshal Ney that he had retained me. I thanked him but declined, saying that in wartime one must never lose a moment in reaching their post. He spent the entire evening questioning the man who hosted him about the region's conditions and the customs of its inhabitants. It was clear he hoped to be considered for something in Poland and, just in case, sought to gather useful information while gaining supporters and friends everywhere he went. With this first part of the campaign concluded, the army took up its winter quarters. On the far right, the 5th Corps, Lan, guarded Warsaw, positioned in the angle formed by the Narew, the Bug, and the Vistula rivers, from which the Russians had been driven. Next came Marshal Davout's 3rd Corps at Pultusk, Solt's 4th Corps at Golymin, Augereau's 7th Corps further back at Plonsk, and Ney's 6th Corps in the vicinity of Mlawa and Neidenburg, near the sources of the Narew's tributaries. This position connected the Grande Armée to Bernadotte's 1st Corps, quartered near Osterode, and extending toward the coast to defend the lower Vistula and support the upcoming siege of Danzig. Every precaution was taken to maintain communication between the different corps. All Vistula crossings, including Warsaw, Thorn, and Graudenz, once it was under our control, were fortified. Orders were issued to ensure the supply of provisions, but the season made transportation difficult, and I often saw the soldiers reduced to surviving on whatever they could forage locally. Marshal Ney established his headquarters at Neidenburg, along the route from Ostrolenka to Thorn. We remained there from December 27th to January 11th, 1807, lodged in the bailiff's house, which we fully occupied, save for 2 rooms reserved for the bailiff and his family. The marshal himself had only a small bedroom and a study, leaving us a large drawing room. Despite the constant noise we made throughout the day, he never seemed the least bit annoyed. Besides singing and jokes, gambling became our primary pastime, with one of us often, and fortunately in turns, going to bed penniless. The joy of the winners, as loud as the fury of the losers, was amplified by a trumpet one of us had acquired. At last, the marshal pleaded for mercy, and the trumpet disappeared. I admired his patience, but the day we departed, he sought his revenge. When mounting his horse, he could not find his guide. Hearing us crack a few innocent jokes, he rebuked us, saying we thought only of trivialities, learned nothing, and would be good for nothing. He even put his senior aide-de-camp under arrest for failing to manage us properly. In just 15 minutes, he vented all the frustration he had endured for the past 2 weeks. The marshal was incapable of delivering a calm reprimand. He either said nothing or lost his temper entirely. Despite this volatile nature, he had a good heart, a sound mind, and impeccable judgment, qualities invaluable in a military leader. The 6th Corps' rest was short-lived. On January 11th, we departed Neidenburg for Wartenburg and Allenstein. General Colbert's vanguard occupied Bartenstein, pushing its outposts as close as possible to Königsberg. The infantry divisions followed at considerable distances. The marshal made a quick trip to Bartenstein, and I accompanied him. Historian M. Thiers claimed he nearly captured Königsberg, but that is an exaggeration. I do not believe the vanguard ever went beyond Preußisch Eylau. Even with the Prussian army's physical and moral decline, more than a cavalry brigade would have been needed to take Königsberg. What then was the purpose of these movements, which the Emperor had not ordered? Firstly, to secure much-needed provisions. Secondly, to approach Königsberg and perhaps gain the glory of being the first to enter it. On some occasion, Marshal Ney concluded a brief armistice with the Prussian vanguard at Bartenstein. However, as these movements required explanation to the Emperor, I was sent from Bartenstein to Warsaw. This journey proved to be the most difficult I have ever undertaken, as the following account will illustrate. I departed Bartenstein on the evening of January 15th, travelling by sleigh in terrible weather. Post horses took me through Heilsberg, Allenstein, and Neidenburg to Mlawa, where my hardships began. The region I entered had been ravaged by the passage of both Russian and French troops, as well as the battles of Pultusk and Golymin. It was challenging to secure horses in Mlawa, and even more so in Siekieną, where I arrived on January 17th. I had to badger the mayor and rely on Jewish residents, our only resource in Poland, as they alone understood German. Finally, I obtained 2 worn-out horses and a rickety cart to carry me to Pultusk. The thaw had been replaced by frost. Along the route from Kirchenau to Pultusk, horses and vehicles were first mired in mud, now frozen solid into the ground. The villages were completely devastated. A league from Kirchenau, a wheel on my cart broke, delaying me further. At Golemin, although my horses were exhausted, I had to press on, unable to find replacements. My driver assured me I could get new horses at Pesimodowo, a village 2 leagues from Pultusk. I arrived there in the evening and stopped at the manor, where the staff of a 4th Corps regiment provided me with shelter. They promised horses, which I waited for a long time before they finally brought me to Pultusk. There I waited even longer for 2 horses, a poor sleigh, and a completely deaf driver who spoke only Polish. A league from Pultusk, the sleigh shattered into pieces in a forest. I proceeded on foot, with my driver leading on horseback, carrying a package I was delivering to the Major General. After nearly 4 leagues on foot in this state, I arrived at dawn in a village where the local nobility, who spoke Latin, promised me horses. I ultimately had to take them by force from peasants. At last, I reached Sirosk, where I found the postal service restored. I crossed the Bug River on a ferry, as the bridge had not yet been repaired. Ice floes made the crossing perilous, but I arrived safely. Fresh horses took me to Nieporen, and another set brought me to Warsaw, where I successfully completed this most unusual journey. However, I have undertaken missions even more challenging. At least in this case, my direction was clear, and I only had to contend with fatigue. If I carried my dispatches on foot, it was not my fault. But there were times when I spent entire nights in the middle of forests, on treacherous paths, exposed to rain or half-melted snow blown into my face by the north wind, fearing my horse might stumble, that my guide might lead me astray, and feeling the full weight of responsibility for the orders I carried. On one such mission, I witnessed the kindness of the Germans. My carriage overturned in a village we had burned down, and the inhabitants, emerging from their half-destroyed homes, helped me right it. In Spain, they would have fired shots at me instead. One day the Emperor kept me in Warsaw and sent me back on the 18th with Colonel Jomini, who was entrusted with a special verbal mission for Marshal Ney. Here is the reason. The letter I carried had irritated Napoleon, and he expressed his displeasure with the Marshal in very harsh terms. What was the meaning of these movements he had not ordered, which exhausted the troops and could put them at risk? Procuring provisions? Expanding into the territory? Entering Königsberg? It was his prerogative to direct the movements of his army and provide for its needs. Who had authorized Marshal Ney to conclude an armistice? A right that belonged exclusively to the Emperor as supreme commander. For this act alone, generals had previously been brought before an inquiry council. Jomini was therefore tasked with conveying the Emperor's displeasure. During our journey, he kindly shared all this with me, and I deeply appreciated the trust he showed me, which I did not betray. Our return was not without difficulties, although they were less severe than those I faced on the way there. We rejoined the Marshal in Allenstein, but significant events had occurred in our absence. After losing the Battle of Pultusk, General Benningsen moved to the left bank of the Narew River and advanced along it, while General Buxhowden did the same on the right bank. However, they could not unite with the main army because the ice had destroyed the bridges. It would have been easy to defeat these 2 isolated portions of the Russian army. But the terrible thaw and the deluge of mud I described earlier prevented us from observing the enemy's movements or pursuing them effectively. The generals eventually reunited at Novogrod, upstream of Ostrolenka, on the Narew. Benningsen wanted to resume the offensive and had just convinced his colleague when he was appointed commander-in-chief, and Buxhowden was recalled. Nothing stood in the way of executing his plan. The plan involved bypassing the vast forests covering the region, crossing the chain of lakes and moving toward the coastal area and the Vistula via Aris, Rastenburg, and Bischofstein. This maneuver aimed to relieve Danzig and outflank Napoleon's position ahead of Warsaw, forcing him to abandon it. The Russian army thus shifted from our extreme right to our extreme left. They hoped to surprise the cantonments of the 1st and 6th Corps, destroy the left wing of our army, and force the right wing to retreat. This bold, well-conceived plan required swift and vigorous execution. If Napoleon had time to concentrate his forces, he could march on the Russians, outflank them, and trap them against the sea. The dispersed positions of the 6th and 1st Corps on the left wing initially favoured the Russian general. The 5th, 3rd, 4th, and 7th Corps were relatively close together around Warsaw. The 6th Corps, linking the 7th to the 1st, covered a vast area, and Marshal Ney's excursions toward Königsberg further separated it from the rest of the army. The vanguard was still in Bartenstein, while the divisions were stationed further back in Allenstein and Hohenstein when the Russian army, advancing from Rastenburg, moved toward Heilsberg via Bischofstein. General Kolbe, commanding our vanguard, retreated hastily. His troops, almost encircled at Bischofstein on January 21st, fought their way through and regrouped at Allenstein. Marshal Ney, stationed in the town, dispatched all his officers to concentrate his forces toward Hohenstein and Gilgenberg to close ranks with the 1st Corps, which was regrouping at Osterode. Having arrived in Warsaw on January 20th, I set out again on the evening of the 21st to deliver orders to General Marchand, who was supposed to be in Hohenstein. I departed at night, braving intense cold. Upon reaching Hohenstein, I could not find the general and had to travel 3 leagues to a village he had designated as his headquarters. There were no French troops in the village, and the locals only spoke Polish. Eventually I found someone who knew a bit of German and told me that a general was staying at a chateau 2 leagues away. Guessing this was the man I sought, I went there and finally found him. On the morning of the 22nd, I left to rejoin the marshal in Neidenberg. The cold was so severe, and I took so few precautions, that I arrived in Gilgenberg with frostbitten ears. 2 women managed to save them by rubbing them with snow. After resting briefly, I continued my journey, travelling through the night to reach Neidenberg. However, after enduring countless hardships, I discovered the marshal was not there. I only found Colonel Jomini, who was returning to Warsaw. He informed me of the enemy's movements, which I was unaware of since we were never told anything, and directed me to Hohenstein, where I arrived on the morning of the 23rd. This example highlights the immense challenges and difficulties we often faced in fulfilling our missions. Beyond enduring fatigue, privations and suffering day and night in all seasons, we were plagued by the fear of failure. Can one believe that a general would change his cantonment 3 times without informing his superior? Even more surprising, how could Marshal Ney tolerate such inexcusable negligence? The troops remained around Hohenstein for 3 days, where the Labasset Brigade, 50th and 59th Regiments, formed the garrison. The headquarters, somewhat exposed, had only a cavalry outpost for protection, which was constantly harassed by Cossacks and eventually overrun on the morning of the 26th. However, the garrison's steadfastness deterred the enemy from attempting a more serious assault. On the 27th, the 6th Corps resumed its retreat toward Tannenberg and Gilgenberg, reaching the latter on the 28th without being pursued or even followed. The Corps concentrated there in the following days. Marshal Bernadotte successfully withdrew on our left with greater merit, as his scattered troops faced more serious attacks. Informed by Marshal Ney of the Russians' movements, both marshals resolved to concentrate their forces at Osterode and Gilgenberg. The 6th Corps executed this plan, as previously mentioned. The 1st Corps, being highly dispersed, advanced in various directions. The troops led personally by Bernadotte encountered the Russian vanguard at Morungen, ahead of Liebstadt. Despite having only 9,000 soldiers who had just marched 10 leagues, Bernadotte did not hesitate to attack 16,000 well-positioned enemies who had been stationed there since the previous day. He fought his way through, losing 700 men while inflicting 1,600 casualties on the enemy, and reached Osterode as the Russians regrouped at Liebstadt, once again imagining themselves victorious after capturing Bernadotte's supply train at Mohrungen. Thus, despite the bold and well-coordinated Russian plan, poor execution and a lack of cohesion by their commander allowed two isolated corps to retreat with minimal losses. These corps reunited in a strong position on the Osterode plateau, holding firm until reinforcements arrived. That moment had come. Napoleon, upon learning of the Russians' movements, broke camp to confront them directly. He left the 5th Corps at Serok, at the confluence of the Bug and Nehru rivers, to defend Warsaw against 2 Russian divisions that had stayed behind. With these precautions taken, he set out with the Imperial Guard, the Cavalry Reserve, and the 3rd, 4th, and 7th Corps. His plan was as follows. While the Russians attempted to reach the lower Vistula to outflank his position near Warsaw on the upper Vistula, Napoleon manoeuvred to outflank their left, driving them toward the sea and forcing them into Königsberg, where they would be trapped, as the Prussians had been in Lübeck months earlier. The general rendezvous point was Allenstein on the Aller River. The vanguard cavalry, the 4th Corps, and the Imperial Guard advanced via Willemberg. The 3rd Corps took the route through Misniec, the 7th through Neidenburg, and the 6th Corps was to join them via Hohenstein. We departed Gilgenberg on February 2nd, continuously harassed by Cossacks. After a brief rest in Hohenstein, we arrived in Allenstein on the morning of February 3rd. The Emperor was already there. He spoke briefly with Marshal Ney at his bivouac, and we could easily discern from Ney's expression that he had been reprimanded for his risky manoeuvres. The army then shifted left to pursue the enemy in the direction of Jonkowo, along the route to Elbing. Napoleon skillfully ordered Marshal Bernadotte to gradually move closer to the Vistula, even as far as Thorn, to draw the enemy into pursuing him. By luring the Russians to advance their right flank, the Grande Armée could more easily outflank their left and push them toward the lower Vistula and the sea. However, this ruse was foiled when a dispatch addressed to Bernadotte was intercepted by the Cossacks. Benningsen, instead of pursuing the 1st Corps on the lower Vistula, positioned his army between the Alle and the Passage rivers at Jonkowo, seemingly preparing for battle. Napoleon was puzzled by the Russian army's swift assembly in this area, as their movements should not have been quick enough to counter the French march through Allenstein. The truth soon came to light, and realizing his stratagem had been uncovered, Napoleon ordered Marshal Bernadotte to leave the Vistula and promptly support the left flank of the Grande Armée. Nevertheless, he was unafraid of engaging in battle with 75,000 French troops against 90,000 Russians. That concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.